my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Merrill Reese. He's been the play-by-play voice of the Philadelphia Eagles for over 3 decades and can be heard on 94 WIP CBS and HIC Network. He began his career at WPAZ in Potsdam and continued on to WBCB in Levittown, where he is part owner and general manager. He has spent 14 years as sports director of WIP and was the play-by-play voice of NFL Dream Season, an ESPN series. In addition, he has handled tennis play-by-play for Madison Square Garden Television in New York with Billie Jean King. Reese has been named Pennsylvania Sportscaster of the Year by the National Association of Sportscasters and Sports Writers, and was selected as Radio Broadcaster of the Year by the Pennsylvania Association of Broadcasters. He has been the recipient of numerous other awards and honors. A graduate of Temple University, Reese was inducted into the school's Communication Hall of Fame, as well as the Hall of Fame for Pennsylvania sports in Overbrook High School. Please join me in welcoming Merrill Reese.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It is great to be with you. First, our commercial. I am with WBCB. You all want to know about the Eagles, but WBCB is our local radio station. Jackie Garber is here to take orders. We are a great way to get your message out. Now we go to the speech. The truth of the matter is, last year at this time, when people saw me about the Eagles, they would slink along and hold their heads low, and they would say, "What a disaster." The Eagles were coming off a 4-12 season, and I can't tell you how many times I heard people say, you know, regardless of what happens, it's going to take years and years and years for this team to do something. It doesn't happen overnight. And then they made a monumental announcement, and that was the hiring of Chip Kelly as the head coach. I believe that in football, the head coach has a more powerful and more impacting role than a coach or a manager in any other sport. He's like the CEO of a corporation. He's the guy who controls everything. And getting to know Chip Kelly and watch him operate, I've been through so many coaches over the years. And the one coach, to me, who had more spark and more charisma than anybody else was Dick Vermeil. I think we would all agree with that. And then along came Chip. And he has that same effect. The entire culture down at the Eagles NovaCare Center changed. And you could feel it from the moment he moved into those headquarters. And the other thing is, when people ask me about this team going into last season, I honestly started to believe that they could win the NFC East. And this was as soon as last March. And the reason was, I looked around the division. The Giants were a declining team. The Cowboys are a mess. In fact, one of the writers down there wrote, it doesn't matter if Jason Garrett is the coach or they can bring back Vince Lombardi, as long as the 6 people who run that team all have the last name of Jones, they're going to be a mess. And the Washington Redskins are owned by Daniel Snyder, who is the worst owner in the history of organized sports. So I looked around and I said, you know, this is not a great division. Now, the next thing you know is Chip hired a great staff. Billy Davis came in, a tremendous defensive coordinator. Pat Shermer, who had been the head coach of the Cleveland Browns. Pat's a great coach. His only problem was that Joe Banner went to Cleveland and fired him immediately, and then hired a new coach and fired him, and then finally they fired Joe Banner, which was probably the best thing to happen to the Cleveland Browns. Then the quarterback situation came up, and people said, well, who do they have? They have Michael Vick, and you all know that he can't play 16 games. And then there's Nick Foles. And I can't believe the people who said to me, well, you know, Nick Foles is a backup quarterback. I watched him when he was at the University of Arizona, and he was surrounded by inferior talent. They were going through coaching changes, coordinator changes, and he never really had a chance to develop. But when you looked at him, what did he lack? He's 6'5". You can't teach 6'5". I've tried to learn that all my life. Like, you can't teach someone to be 6'5". And he has size 10 and a half hands. And he can throw the ball through a car wash without it getting wet. And he's accurate, and he's smart, and he's dedicated. I really believe that in Nick Foles, they have an absolute gem who can be a franchise quarterback on this team for years to come. Then the May camps came, and the training camps began, and they went through an incident last summer that could have totally destroyed and wrecked everything about the chemistry of that team. And that, all of you know, is the Riley Cooper incident, where he was ridiculous and used the wrong terms at the wrong time. It was an absolute disgrace. And I thought at the time the best thing the Eagles could possibly do was to cut him, get him out of there. And right after that happened, Michael Vick stepped up along with Jason Avant, and they went to that locker room and they said, we've got to give this guy another chance. And when people talk to me about players, we're always talking about games. The great thing about this game is the people you get to meet. When they signed Michael Vick 4 years ago, I was in the broadcast booth doing a preseason game. My partner, Mike Quick, said, hey, I just got some news. I said, save it till after the break. We're in the fourth quarter of a preseason game, but the people out there are only known to their mothers. So we come back, and Mike says, the Eagles are about to sign Michael Vick. And my heart sunk, because I'm a dog lover, and I was just absolutely aghast at his involvement in the dog fighting ring. And that's the last player I wanted to see the Eagles get. And then I got to know Michael Vick. And over time, I got to see a guy who totally changed his life. Totally. Did all kinds of charity things without even being told. Did things for the Humane Society, visited school kids, hurricane victims after Sandy struck, came back from New Orleans in the middle of the night and went down the shore to shelters. He's done so many great things. And when I look back at Michael Vick, I say, here's one of the finest individuals that I have ever been around in all of these years. I have never seen somebody so dramatically and sincerely change his life. And he was the leader who got that team together. He was the catalyst who, even though he didn't play a great role as a quarterback this year, he was the guy who saved Chip Kelly's team from disaster. He and Jason Avant, who was leaving this year, another outstanding human being. Then the season began, and we were anticipating what would it be like in Washington on that Monday night, September 9th. Well, they came out on fire. I mean, the Redskins didn't know what hit them. And people looked at Chip Kelly's offense and they said, you know what? This team is going to be unstoppable on offense. Well, then the next week came, and they were stoppable. They lost to San Diego, and the following week, it's the big matchup. Chip Kelly against Andy Reid's Kansas City Chiefs, and again, they fell flat. And the following week, the Eagles went to Denver, and I developed a case of whiplash from my neck going like this, with haymaking touchdown passes to one receiver, another receiver. I mean, that was a complete annihilation. They gave up over 50 points to the Broncos. And at this point, they're 1-3. And I'm starting to say, you know what? Maybe all of that optimism is misguided. Maybe this is going to be another disastrous season, going through all kinds of growing pains. Then came the key game. And that was on October the 6th at the Meadowlands against the Giants. And the Eagles trailed early in that game, and Michael Vick took off down the left sideline, and as he went out of bounds, you could see him pull up with a terrible hamstring pull, and he could hardly move. And in came Nick Foles, and he rallied the team, and they went on to beat the Giants. And that gave everybody a very, very big lift. Following week, Vick was unable to come back. It was Foles again in Tampa Bay, and they beat the Bucs, beat them handily. Then came Sunday, October 26th, Eagles and the Dallas Cowboys at the Lake. And Nick Foles was absolutely awful, as was this entire team. And the game ended for Foles when he had a concussion. One of the writers actually said on the air, on Comcast, he said, I hope we have seen the last of Nick Foles. And people wondered about Nick Foles.
I will tell you the true story. He was not hurt. He did not have a concussion early in that game. What he was sick. He was sick the entire week. They will probably never admit this, but I was there. Nick Foles could hardly pick up his head. He had fever. He had some kind of virus. That morning when he went out, he had no strength in his arm. He was totally, he should have been in a bed getting an IV. But he was sick the day of the Dallas Cowboys game. That is the real reason behind his subpar performance. But at that point, everyone's saying, you know what, I know he can't play. I know he can't play. So the following week, they were happy to see Vic come back, and he lasted one series. And he went out again with a hamstring, and in came Matt Barkley, who was anything but ready to go play. So they had a terrible loss that week against the Giants, and then Foles was ready again. And we go out to Oakland, and nobody knows what they're going to see. What they saw was one of the greatest quarterback performances of all time. Statistically, historically, he threw 7 touchdown passes against the Oakland Raiders, and off they went again. And they beat the Raiders, and they won 4 more games, including one of the most unforgettable games I have ever seen. How many of you were enthralled by that snow game against the Detroit Lions? I mean, in the first quarter, it was so heavy that I was looking out of the booth, and all I saw were little stick figures. I mean, I couldn't see numbers, and I was trying to figure out who was coming out of which slot. And then, again, Foles ignited them. They were behind, and Foles brought them back with a big pass to Riley Cooper, and Shady McCoy, an amazing running back. In fact, I think one of the great running backs in the history of this franchise. There have been 4. The late Steve Van Buren, back way before all of us, and then Wilbur Montgomery, Brian Westbrook, and Shady McCoy. Aside from Van Buren, I think that Shady McCoy is the best of this modern era. Never saw anything like him. Gained 217 yards rushing in that game, and the Eagles went on to beat the Lions. They had one glitch. A bad game in Minnesota, but still Foles threw for over 300 yards in that game. So it was great. And then they ended the season with terrific wins against the Bears on a Sunday night, and then they beat the Dallas Cowboys in Texas to end the season and make it to the playoffs. It was an amazing season. This is a team that went from 4-12 to 10-6, from last place to first place in the NFC East. I think the future for this team is very, very bright. It's funny, I hear people talk about the free agency and about the fact that Malcolm Jenkins is the guy they signed, and why would they sign Jarvis Bird, this and that, this and that. Do you really think, when you hear all these shows and read all these columns, that any of them know? Do you think that if anybody, how many of you have watched Buffalo? How many of us have watched any of these teams? We watched New Orleans and actually isolated on the safety. Let me tell you something. Chip Kelly rules down at the Eagles headquarters. He coached Bird in Oregon. If Chip Kelly felt that Jarvis Bird was the player that would make this defense a Super Bowl defense, he would have gone to Howie Roseman and to Jeffrey Lurie, and the Eagles would have had him. So obviously, he was not the missing piece. They got a guy that they think is good. In football, as in business, you have to make salary considerations. You have to have a strategy. And you have to figure this whole thing out. It's not that the Eagles are too cheap to go after these big-name free agents. It's that there's only everybody in football spends about the same amount of money, because you have a salary cap, and there's a minimum, and then there's a ceiling. You have to spend the same amount of money. So it's not a matter of cheapness. You have to feel and find out where that money is going to be allocated. Next year, if Foles has another good season, and I know he will, if he has another good season, he's going to take a lot of money to keep. They've got to have the money to sign him. If you look at the deterioration and the disintegration of the Dallas Cowboys, it's how poorly they have handled that salary cap. They got rid of the Marcus Square. their best defensive player yesterday because they can no longer afford to keep him at his current salary and he's not going to take a pay cut. That team is falling apart because they mismanaged that. So the Eagles know what they're doing. I'm not here to be an arm of the public relations department, and any of you who've listened to our broadcast know that when they're playing poorly, I will say they play poorly, but they know what they're doing. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun to watch. Now, when people say they give me a prediction, that's a tough thing to do. I can stand up here and tell you that if everything goes right, if this team reaches its peak, if the defense steps up, maybe gets another outside pass rusher, if Nick Foles continues to develop, and I think he will, and Jeremy Maclin is back, it would not shock me to see the Eagles go to the Super Bowl next year. It would not shock me, because this is a quick fix league. On the other hand, I don't care who you're talking about. Every year, whoever wins the Super Bowl, you say, well, they're going to be great for years. Well, Baltimore wasn't so great last year. And now Seattle. Seattle looks indomitable. But you know what? If you take Seattle, San Francisco, Baltimore, New England, any of these upper echelon teams, if they have the wrong 3 injuries at the wrong time of the season, a team that is potentially 13-3 can very quickly be 8-8. That's how quickly it can happen in the National Football League. And if you get into the playoffs, anything can happen. So I loved what I saw this year, and I think we have a lot more to look forward to in this coming season. If any of you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them. Yes?
Chip Kelly, his work ethic. Can you give a description of how he runs his day?
He's total energy. I mean, he's never standing in one place. And the music is blaring, and the energy shakes around there. He has this whole dietary thing with the sports science, and he's running around the field. He's a lot of fun to watch. I mean, he's talking to this, like he's all over the field. With Buddy Ryan, who I also love, by the way, he would stand in one spot, twirling his whistle, and he saw everything. With Andy Reid, he'd be working with the offense, but Chip is all over the place. Certainly his area of focus is the offense, but he is energetic, and he reminds me so much of Vermeil in that sense. He's funny, he's sarcastic, but the players love him. They will go through a wall for Chip Kelly. And that's a great thing when you have a leader like that everybody wants to play for. People really want to come here, and Chip is a big part of that reason. Yes?
What do you think of our defensive coordinator?
The best. The best. Bill Davis is a great defensive coordinator. People criticized him earlier because he wasn't that successful in Arizona. He had his problems in Cleveland. Let me tell you something. When you're talking about a coordinator or a coach, you can't go by their record. Because when they're an assistant coach, they have no control over personnel. They have no control over the draft. They only can coach what is given to them. But Bill Davis is one. I've been around great defensive coordinators, great. And I'm talking about Bud Carson, who was one of the great geniuses that I've ever seen, and Jim Johnson, who was absolutely outstanding. You will find one day, I will make a prediction right now, within the next 5 years, maybe even the next 3 years, Bill Davis will be a head coach. They'll lose him because he's that good, he's that dynamic, he's that smart. He will be a head coach. He's that good. Yes?
Any other predictions on free agents?
You know, it's tough to tell. I just see where... One thing I have learned over the years, we tend to fall in love with names. I've seen great names. I remember Hall of Fame wide receiver Jim Lofton came to the Eagles. I said, wow, they've got Jim Lofton. But he had nothing left. He was no longer Jim Lofton. I'll tell you a story about free agents. 3 years ago, my wife and I were playing in a couples golf tournament on a Friday night, and I had my cell phone in the car on buzz. And our son, who is very proud of him, he is a 31-year-old visual effects editor. He was the visual effects editor of The Lone Ranger. He's the visual effects editor of the Muppet movie, which comes out this month. And now he's working on something called Guardians of the Galaxy for Marvel. But he comes home and he'll meet me on the road a lot of times when we're in Denver, different places. He loves to come out and keep statistics for the broadcast. But he was home for a summer visit. And he and his friends were over at PJ Wheelahands and watching the ESPN. And all of a sudden, I know he never calls me on the golf course, and the phone is ringing. And I'm like, no. I said, yeah, what is it? He said, Dad, listen to me. The Eagles just signed Nnamdi Asomugha. And I went, Nolan, they just punched the ticket to the Super Bowl. Because Nnamdi Asomugha, along with Darrelle Revis, was considered to be the best defensive back in the entire National Football League. He was a disaster. He couldn't play in this system. In fact, he couldn't play. And he was weird. When the players went into the cafeteria for lunch, he went into the parking lot and ate in his car. And Angela Catoli of WIP one morning said to me, did you know he was eating lunch in his car? I said, well, I got the idea because I pulled up next to him one morning and he lowered the window and said, well, I passed the Grey Poupon. But it never worked out. And now I see that the Patriots are about to sign Merrill Reese. Now, they have Revis Island. Nobody would venture into Revis Island. I can tell you this. I don't know much about Malcolm Jenkins because he didn't really appear into that little screen that I see when I broadcast the Eagles and the Saints. But I do know that last year when the Eagles were in Tampa Bay and the Bucs were paying Darrelle Revis $19 million, Deshaun Jackson ran by him like he was standing still. I mean, he didn't just beat him by a step. There were 5 yards between Deshaun Jackson and Darrelle Revis. He was coming off an ACL. He could be back. He could be great for New England, or he could be an unmitigated disaster. How great was Javon Curse when the Eagles brought him in? He had a decent season, but after that, nothing. Don't fall in love with names, because in this sport, you can go from all pro to all gone in a matter of a half a step. So we tend to fall in love, oh, they just got this big name free agent. It doesn't mean anything. It's all about production. Last year they signed some players, and I can't tell you that I was jumping up and down when they signed Connor Barwin. What a great player. How many big plays did he make? And he's special. The year before they signed Amigo Ryans, and everyone expected a lot, but then they put him in the defense, coached by an offensive line coach, and he was a disaster. This past year, D'Amico Ryans was terrific. So it's about coaching, it's about scheme, it's about getting a player at his right peak. That's what it's all about. Yes?
There's been a recent trend of successful college coaches that then come into the NFL, find out it's not their thing, and do whatever they can to get back to the college game. I'm going to assume that you think that's not the case with Chip Kelly. I want to know why you think that.
Well, I think it's not the case with Chip Kelly because he has made the transition to the NFL faster than any of these college coaches that I can remember. There's only one other that I can think of who made an amazing transition, and that's Jimmy Johnson, who came in and they traded to slow people, and then he took the Cowboys to consecutive Super Bowls. So he made it. I don't think it's about what your background is, whether you're a college coach or whether it's a coordinator. I think as long as you have the knowledge and you have the leadership ability and you have the organization behind you, you can do it. There has been nothing that Chip Kelly has ever said that indicated that he wants to go back to college football. I just think he's a football lifer who's passionate about the game. He eats, sleeps, drinks football, and now he's coaching at the highest level. I don't think he misses Oregon, especially not when he has a winning football team and everybody's talking about Chip Kelly. I think he's here to stay. Yes?
Merrill was talking about changing the point at a touchdown. Is that going to actually happen? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that just always talks about something. I've heard them talk about eliminating kickoffs. and maybe moving the point after touchdown back to make it a 40-yard kick. They're always tinkering a little bit. We'll see. I hate to see that change. That's pretty dramatic, I think. The only thing I will say is people say the game's not the way it was, and that the great hits that we love in the game, Brian Dawkins pummeling a receiver as he came across the middle, Ed Reed, Troy Polamalu, now you hit them and it's marginal and the flag goes down and there's a 15-yard penalty and you can't hit an unprotected receiver. There's all kinds of things you can't do. But we live in a litigious society where there are all kinds of suits, and the league realizes that if they don't do something to lessen the serious injuries, there will be no football. That the game will go the way of dinosaurs. And they have to make it safer. They have to continue research on helmets and equipment, but they also have to take away, even though it was a very exciting part of football, they have to take away that big hit where helmets collide and players' bodies go crumbling down. I mean, I love the game. I'm passionate about the game. It's the greatest team sport ever invented, but it's a very, very dangerous sport. And if my son had wanted to play football, I would have let him play football. But I would never talk somebody into playing the sport because it's cruel and it's punishing, and you get hurt playing football. So if they can save people from developing all of these syndromes where at 50 years old they can't remember their names, and you look at somebody like Kevin Turner who has ALS, which they feel there's a growing thought that perhaps all of the head injuries contributed to this. If they can do something like that to take these serious, you're never going to take the serious injuries out of the game, but if you can lessen them, if you can diminish the numbers of serious life-altering injuries, they've got to do it. Yes?
Is there a practical joker on the Eagles? And if so, can you think of a particular time that a practical joke was played in the Nova Care Center or something like that? Or not, maybe not this year, but in previous years?
There are guys who are funny in the locker room. John Dorenbos, the long snapper, he's a lot of fun. There's a lot of guys, but there's not a lot of, it's a work atmosphere. There's not a lot of that. The only greatest practical joker I have ever been around, I'll tell you this, was a guy who passed away 13 years ago, and he was my statistician for many years, and his name was Jack Ellenstein. And Jack had grown up and knew Leonard Toast, was kind of a court jester, and he was a very, very conservative-looking, middle-aged man, rarely smiled, but you never knew what he was going to do next. He would double talk. Dick Vermeer would bring him in and say that he was a member of the league office to discuss rule changes, and he would start to talk, and every third word would mean nothing, and the rookies are writing down notes, and they look at each other's papers, and he's saying nothing. And I had to watch him carefully in the booth. I'll tell you one quick story. When you do a game, you use the national anthem to break away for 90 seconds of commercials. Because, I mean, who wants to hear national anthem on radio played from a field, a mile away? So that's 3 30-second commercials. But every now and then, you come back a little early, or the national anthem goes a little bit long. And when that happens, I feel compelled to say, that's the national anthem here at Lincoln Financial Field, as performed by Patty LaBelle, or whoever was doing it that day. We were in Pittsburgh for a preseason game, and sure enough, there was some kind of choir on the field singing the national anthem. And we're coming back 15 seconds early, and we're picking up the last 15 seconds of the national anthem. So I screamed out in the booth with my microphone cut, "Quick, somebody get me the anthem singers." And there's a rundown sheet. The rundown sheet will tell the name. So I didn't realize it was Jack. And he wrote it down, and he passed it over to me. And I'm getting set to do the national anthem. And without thinking, I take the paper and I read. And that was the national anthem here at Three River Stadium, as performed by the Pennsylvania home for the criminally insane glee club. Now, it doesn't compute. Now I go into the starting lineups. And halfway through the starting lineups, I'm thinking, did I say the Pennsylvania home for the criminally insane glee club? And I fell apart. And I had to go back for more commercials until I could compose myself. So he was the